This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this morning we're here to talk about what you need to know about restrictive practices and what restrictive practices are. So we've got 11 people, or 11 calls come in so far, or log-ons, and wondering if there's anybody out there that have come in today that are a group sitting watching together that can join in some conversation, or if everybody's just on their own logged in.
I think we've
Just
got
remember,
lots of individuals.
I'm
I
just
think
on
we've got
my
lots of
own.
individuals today.
great, okay. So we have a chat panel just underneath. If you've got any questions or any comments as we go through the presentation today, please do feel free to pop something in that chat panel and I'll answer it as we go. I'll give some pauses every now and again. If you want to just pop yourself on mute for most of the time and then just unmute yourself if you've got something that you want to say or ask. And honestly, I'm happy to be interrupted at any time. It feels a little lonely when it's only a kind of one-way dialogue for me. So, yeah, so we're going to talk about restrictive practices and I guess more importantly about the process around restrictive practices and how we can and can't use them and why, essentially, I guess. Why we generally don't and what some other alternatives are. I also want to flag at this point that I think it's Friday of next week, we're going to be doing the session on therapeutic parenting, which will link to this session in terms of some options of how to care. So this morning I'm going to go through some of the drier bits in terms of definitions and legislation, and then talk about what restrictive practices are. Then I'm going to talk through some different options of what you can do instead. I'm going to talk through planning around the use of restrictive practices and what that looks like. So how to work with the legislation and the Office of the Children's Guardian requirements. And then we're going to finish with a case study. And it'll give you some ideas about what behaviour support plan looks like for children when they are displaying
Danielle,
challenging.
I'll just jump in there and just the top tips for therapeutic parenting webinar is on the 31st of May, so it's 2 weeks' time.
2 weeks, excellent. Okay, so let's start with the principles. Oh, got my thing on the wrong spot. And so basically the principles of reflective practice is that it's based on the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child to live free from abuse and harm and to feel safe and supported within their environments. So we need to be fostering a positive, safe and approach to human rights and also respect through therapeutic approaches. We also, in this process of deciding whether restrictive practices are something to include in a plan for a child, it's really essential that a child or young person is engaged in planning for that plan so they understand what kinds of methods are going to be used to assist them to generally regulate. And we talked earlier on in the week about co-regulation and regulation, and a lot of these practices are really about how do we help children regulate in challenging times when behaviours can be getting really difficult. So long-term successes and positive outcomes for out-of-home care experiences are generally achieved through promoting a non-aversive and non-punitive therapeutic approach and allowing children to engage in those strategies. So a lot of the things that I'm saying earlier, I don't want to lose you. They are very legalistic or policy-driven kind of responses. As we move further through the presentation this morning, I'm going to get a bit more real about what does that actually look like and how do you actually manage that kind of situation yourself. So the next part is about the legislation. So we work under the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act. And basically, the legislation focuses on prevention of inappropriate or overly restrictive actions by caregivers, such as things that take response to a child or young person's challenging behaviour in that environment. I think what we need to be really mindful of at this point is that we come from a historical approach of parenting, and if we think about our society as a whole, we had very punitive approaches to parenting. So maybe when you as carers were younger, corporal punishment was still in schools, or other forms of discipline were accepted practices of discipline that are now not so accepted practices of discipline. So under Section 158 of the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act, this relates to physical restraint of a child or young person and outlines that there's some specific limitations around when you can use physical restraint, and we're going to talk about that as a specific restrictive practice as we move forward. I've just got a little message here. Do people see the pictures? I just worked out on my phone, you swipe to the right to see your display. So if anybody's on a phone, if you want to swipe to the right, you can see the pictures that we have posted up in the PowerPoint presentation that's going on at the same time. Thanks for letting us know, Sharon. Also, at the end of the presentation, I forward on all the slides to Alex so she can distribute them. And you can have a copy of those for your reference. So definitionally, restrictive practices is where a child or young person's independent access to items, activities and experiences is limited by means of physical barriers in an attempt to decrease or limit their behaviours or access them. For example, putting a lock on the fridge to prevent independent access to food. So that's one example of restrictive practice. Another one that comes up quite frequently is taking kids' mobile phones off them or iPads off them. And we're going to talk more about that as we move on, about other ways that you can manage screen time and things like that that don't fit into restrictive practices. But we also need to think about, if those items were provided by their parent, how can we put a plan in place to manage that? Because if the items belong to them and they're their own item, then taking them off them or limiting their access to them is actually a restrictive practice. So the big question for all of us is, how do we actually manage that? And we'll get to that a little later on. So restrictive practices are basic practices that interfere with their human rights. So in addition to that, any form of corporal punishment. Punishment takes the form of immobilization, force feeding or deprivation of food, and is intended to humiliate or frighten the child or young person. At that point, that particular type of practice is moving into being reportable conduct. And we do have a session, and Alex might be able to look up the date of that one too. We do have one about managing reportable conduct in the future and what that looks like. Okay. Just move on to the next one. So here's some examples of restricted practices, and we call them restrictive because there needs to be a plan in place if they were being used. So the first one is timeout. And for a lot of us, timeout was kind of a parenting practice that came into place to say, here's something that we can do to give the child some space to think about what they've done, those kinds of things, and was a fairly standard parenting practice. It is a restricted practice now because it actually requires for the child to be in a separate space to their parent or carer. And if it's used to manage or change the behaviours of the child or young person, and they're put in a separate space, i.e. sent to their room, it's a restricted practice because this doesn't work for children with trauma. Some children choose to go to their room if they're feeling, like if you think about when we talked about earlier this week around the window of tolerance, we talk about the bottom part below the window at the bottom. When they become more flat and move themselves away, they may choose to go to their room for some time. But the what we're looking for is actually connection and being able to work with that situation. I guess antidotes to timeout might be giving yourself some time out, or having them time in, where they're just sitting in a space where you are already, and having some downtime. So the next one is exclusionary timeout. So this is, putting in a bedroom, and if it was in a bedroom and the door's closed, this is actually can be classed under the legislation as wrongful imprisonment, which sounds really extreme, but when we're talking about children who've experienced trauma, we've also got to fit into the legislation and the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. So going into rooms or things like that, separating, doesn't work for children with trauma. We can talk some more about that. Containment is putting a child in a space. It is a form of timeout, but it's reducing their exposure to stimulus. It may involve withdrawal of the child or young person from a setting where their capacity to control or manage themselves is diminished. We should never ever use any kind of seclusion. I guess when I think about containment, playpens, the cupboard under the stairs, any kind of place that actually prevents them from having interaction with stimulus. So putting babies in cots when they're crying, and removing them to put them in the cot when they've done something wrong, that's actually seclusion and containment. It's not allowing them to move around. Physical restraint. This one is a tricky one, and the one that comes up most commonly, and I was talking with my team this morning about this, is putting children in car seats. So putting the child in the car seat is legal. Obviously, we need to have our children restrained in cars, but if a child is fighting you and not wanting to get into the car seat, the moment that you start putting the child in the car seat is actually physical restraint. So this usually happens and is most frequent around contact. So somebody's coming to pick up the child needs to go in the car, needs to be transported to contact. If we can think about that window of tolerance and think about where that child is, they're generally not operating in their window at that time. There's a lot of anxiety, they don't understand that. So if they're in a car seat, they're of an age younger than the age of 8. And it's particularly the ones that are in the 5-point harness. At that age, they don't actually understand why they're dysregulated, but they know that they're going to see mum or dad or another family member, and actually forcing them into that car seat and doing the buckle up is physical restraint. So we're going to talk about more how that can fit into getting a plan around that for the future. The next one is the use of psychotropic medication. Now, any child that is on any medication, so think about medications that change perception and thinking. So any child diagnosed with ADHD that's on dexamphetamine, Ritalin, any of those, Catapress, anything for mood or level of arousal, or anything that is about behaviour management, such as psychotropic medication, risperidone, those kinds of things, all need to be part of a plan. We're going to talk about plans soon. Okay, response cost is some fancy words, and it also is a norm, like it's something that requires a plan to go with it. It's a common discipline technique. An example might be children are fighting over a toy, and the result is that the toy is removed until the dispute is resolved. And some of this might be, they won't get off the iPad. Okay, the iPad goes away until they've changed their behaviour or something like that. So they lose or forgo something positively valued until the behaviour is changed and it has a punitive function. And the reason why it's restricted practice is because it has a punitive function. And I'm going to relate that back to the window of tolerance soon. So they are the level of all the different restrictive practices definitionally.
Hi, Danielle. I just wanted to mention that the webinar where you'll be talking on tips for getting through the reportable conduct process is the 7th of June, if anybody wants to register for that one.
Great. Okay. So restricted practices, just in terms of what happens in a crisis and what happens if you use any of these things and how to manage that. Because use of restrictive practices without a plan can lead to a reportable conduct investigation. So basically what happens if you use a restrictive practice, then you need to provide information to caseworker or whoever is case managing the child that you're caring for. The child needs to be involved in some therapeutic intervention. They need to be offered to be involved in therapeutic intervention, and carers need to also be offered support at that point in time. So if a crisis happens and things got out of control and, for example, physical restraint was used and the child was held, after that, then there needs to be a conversation with the caseworker, telling them about the situation, what happened, and some intervention needs to be arranged for the child, but also for the carer to assist, because you're at crisis point and something needs to happen to ameliorate the crisis before you can move on. So that's a really important point, because this might actually be the way into getting a plan. I guess, you know, ideally for every kind of behaviour, we want the least restrictive and the least intrusive practice for every kind of behaviour that a child presents with. And I've got a case study we're going to go through a little later, and it'll show you the least restrictive practice for that particular child. So at this point of crisis, going to the caseworker, then being linked up with the therapeutic support can help with the development of a plan, and we'll talk about the plan soon. Now, you may have children in your care and they go for a medication review, or they go to the paediatrician and come out with a script for psychotropic medication. That script can't be filled and the child cannot start taking it until this is approved, and it's in fact it's at a director level, and in NGOs it's by the principal officer of that agency. So a plan needs to be developed about why that psychotropic medication has been prescribed and the use of that psychotropic medication moving forward. So a treatment plan needs to be included in the plan, and this is required by law, and it's also checked by the Office of the Children's Guardian. So when agencies go through an accreditation process, or when children's files are reviewed, it's looking for these plans to support the use of any kind of medication. And obviously medications can't be given unless they're to support a child's ongoing health and well-being in the most positive and least intrusive way possible moving forward. On that, the same can't happen in reverse. You can't take a child off medication without this going through a planning process as well. So it should be unusual to go to a paediatrician and get a script without there having been some level of discussion about what are potential outcomes moving forward. At a very minimum, for a child to start taking medication, the child is in the care of the minister. So therefore there needs to be a decision-making process around that anyway, but to be psychotropic medication, it needs to be the principal officer or the director approving that, so the child can't actually start taking medication until then. You'll find that each of your agencies will have some policy and procedure around that, around storage, safe storage. They may get Webster packs to have the medication split up. There needs to be clear labelling and things like that around medication and the safe use of any kind of medication. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of a run over what is, I guess, restrictive practice, what it looks like. So basically, as we've gone through, anything that restricts a child's activities. Now, we know that we have children with challenging behaviours. So when we think about that window of tolerance from Tuesday's session, so anybody that didn't get Tuesday's session, hopefully you can log on to the My Forever Family website and have a look at that in terms of regulation, emotional regulation. So if a child runs pretty high in their window for most of the time and very easily goes outside of their window, you may need to have some positive behaviour support planning happen. So in this cycle, it just talks about assessment and goal setting. So assessment and goal setting happens with you as the carer, the agency, and whoever the therapeutic practitioner is at the time, and the casework staff that are caring for the child. So in that assessment and goal setting is looking at, okay, what are all of these behaviours? What's actually happening for this child? What do the behaviours look like? How do they play out? When do they play out? And what's the hardest part about providing care to this child? So also in that assessment and goal setting, there needs to be some work done with the child as well. So the child needs to be understanding what it is that you need to be talking about. Moving around to 2 is developing a plan. Now, I've called it a positive behaviour support plan. They're called different things in different agencies. This is just generalised terms. Some are therapeutic behaviour support plans. One that I'm working on at the moment, we refer to as a critical incident and response plan. So the planning happens from the meeting in terms of thinking about what are all of these behaviours and how do we manage them in the least intrusive way possible. And then the clinician, so the therapeutic support worker, is the one that actually drafts the plan, and they match what the behaviour is, what the antidote kind of behaviour activity is to support that child in that situation. This plan can actually include restricted practices. However, if it does, or the whole plan is approved at the director level or at the principal officer level to demonstrate that whatever that practice is the least intrusive way of managing that child's behaviour. So whilst I've said everything is so far that has been restrictive is definitely restrictive practices, however, they can be used in the behaviour support plan if it is the least intrusive way of managing that child's behaviour. So then the implementation of the plan is between casework staff and carers to work through how does this look. Now for every approved plan, there is a monitor meeting every 3 months. So 3 monthly, there's an opportunity to change that plan. If there's a critical incident, there's absolutely opportunities to change the plan in the meantime, responding to critical incidences. But as a rule, it will happen 3 months regardless of the progress of the plan. 3 monthly it will happen. It may happen sooner if there's a critical incident, but it won't happen any longer than 3 months. And that's also set out by the Office of the Children's Guardian in terms of when does this happen, to ensure that we're staying on top of those plans and that children aren't engaged in restrictive practices long term with no clear ending. Behaviour support plans or therapeutic support plans should be, sorry about my phone ringing then. So behaviour support plans are meant to be something that reduces over time as behaviour changes. So as children heal from the trauma they've experienced, the number of behaviours should actually reduce, or as they settle into a placement, the number of behaviours should reduce over time, or the severity of those behaviours should reduce over time. Okay, I'm going to take a breath and find out if anybody's got any questions so far before we move into what we can do instead. I don't have any questions in my panel at the moment, but if anybody's on the line and want to ask.
I can imagine, listening to a lot of this would be quite daunting. So if anybody's got some concerns or thoughts about it, before we move into how to manage it, please have a chat.
I have a question. Only my reception is really bad and it keeps dropping out. So there was one part there that I missed a lot of, and I noticed it's being recorded. Are we able to get a copy of the recording of this?
What my aim is, it's Hannah, is it?
It's Hannah, yes. It's not user-friendly, sorry.
Hi, it's Alex here. My aim is to get these recordings up onto our website so you can access them whenever you like. But if you also want to send me an email, I'm happy to send you this slideshow as well.
That would be wonderful, because I missed the restrictive practices when she went through those points, and I'm moving my computer around everywhere trying to get a better reception. It's driving me crazy.
Yeah, I'm working with our web people to get these recordings up on our website somewhere, because I think it'll be good to be able to go back and listen to them.
Yeah, I missed that part, and I wanted to hear that part. It was so important. So
sorry about that, Hannah.
No, that's not your fault. That's my fault. And I was sort of got my computer and I was running around and like, so I missed all of that. But the slides are great, but I just missed what she was talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not detailed step by step in the slide.
No, not in that part. I mean, most of it's good because the slides are key points and you sort of jogs your memory what you talked about in that part. But I didn't hear what we talked about in that part.
No worries. We'll probably have a bit of time for a recap, Hannah.
That would be absolutely awesome if we do. Sorry.
No worries. And Irina,
next time I'll know better. This is my first webinar, so next time I'll know where to sit.
We're glad that you're here. Irina, I've got your message about loving the slides from this webinar and the last one as well. So
thank you. I'm stoked to be here.
Sorry, what was that? Oh.
I'm stoked to be here. I think this is absolutely awesome. I'm sorry I didn't find all of this far sooner than I have.
It's all right, Hannah. We'll give you plenty of opportunity to catch up, and you're only up to number 4 of 12 with a view to be doing more after July as well.
Sorry, I did hear you say log on to the one on Tuesday. Can you log on to previous ones that were there?
So that's what Alex was referring to in terms of their organising for those to be uploaded on the My Forever Family website, so you can go and have a look at those ones.
Because I've registered for all the other ones coming.
Great.
No worries. But I can see your email address, Hannah, so I might send you something separately afterwards. And yes, Irina, we will get those slides out. And maybe Alex, I didn't forward on the slides from last time. I can't remember. But I'll make sure that Alex has the slides from this one and last one as well.
Yep.
Thank you so very much. This is so. I wish I'd had all this information to start with, because it's so informative, and there's stuff there that you just didn't know. It would have been so handy to know this with traumatized children. I read so much, but this is just stuff that you don't read and you don't know.
It is really hard, Hannah, and I think, moving forward, I guess, I really want to qualify for, a lot of you as carers that have been carers for a long time. The research and practice was very different when people signed up to be carers a long time ago to what it is now. And the expectations of you.
Suddenly, I'm a grandparent. I did the PACE course actually, and it happened suddenly with my grandchildren, and it's just been so fast paced, and the help hasn't been there. And people that come to visit me, I'm listening to you, And the people that come to visit me in authorised places have this knowledge and yet never say to you, this is a restricted practice, or this is this, or this is that. They have the knowledge, but they don't share it with you in that moment, which would be really handy if they did.
Yeah, and maybe not everybody does have the knowledge, Hannah, and I think the way that we're breaking it down is really to help you all. So, and agencies are logging in as well to help everybody get a really clearer idea. So really, since the Office of the Children's Guardian and the standards have come out, that this is kind of where we're headed, and I guess we're starting to really, since My Forever Family, really consolidating to make sure it's a consistent message across all carers. So I'll move on now and talk about what we can do.
There was a question, Danielle, from, I think it was Mark.
And this one, yes.
Let me just open it. Let's just have a look. Mark wanted to know, should
agencies to drive the PSB planning process. Do you know what, Mark? Anyone can drive that process. If you think the child that you have in your care needs a positive behaviour support plan, and that's protective of you and of them. I mean, obviously everything we do is to making sure a child is safe and the least intrusive interventions are in place. This is really about giving you some tools to know what you need for this child, because you're the one there 24/7, or at the other end of the phone when they're at school and you're called every 5 minutes, to give you the knowledge and the skills so you can raise it up to say, I think we actually need a plan for this, for this little person, and these are the reasons why, and these strategies do work. However, they are restrictive practices, so we need to be clear that there's a plan in place. And if there's something else that could be used that might be helpful, then sure, engaging a therapeutic practitioner can help with that decision-making process. But often, I think in the hustle and the bustle and the busyness of casework staff, they often don't know the full gamut of restricted practices, and also the full gamut of other options. You know, things like using PACE has only been introduced in this more recent version of shared stories training, and other therapeutic support, therapeutic parenting strategies that we'll talk about the week after next. All of these things are probably more new interventions, and it's really about engaging somebody that knows these interventions, and casework staff are not on top of everything because they've got so much else to be on top of as well. So don't wait would be my message for an agency to say, I think this child needs a therapeutic support plan. So I hope that helps, Mark. Okay, so I've moved on to PACE, being a way of thinking, I would probably say, rather than a parenting strategy. It's a way of thinking, and being playful is a way of being. And we had a bit of a conversation about this in the office this morning, and I think, you know, in our hustle and bustle lives, we tend to forget that element of being playful. Or sometimes if we've grown up in stressful environments, we might not have actually learnt the art of playfulness or of that good humour. And I think, you know, from my perspective of an assessor at times, I often look for humour as something to be a skill or a personal attribute that does assist in being a good carer, because it's able to make light of a situation using good humour. So I actually have something I had earlier. I'll just have to unplug for a sec. So this is a hat that I use in therapy, and it's my husky hat.
I love it. I want one.
And for some therapeutic sessions, I actually wear this hat the whole session with a child. Oh, can't get it on straight. And this is about being playful. When kids talk to me, they're talking to me about the most difficult things that are happening in the universe. So if we can both wear a husky hat, or I think the definition of another one I had on the other day was a magical snow leopard kind of tiger-like thing, is the full terminology for that particular hat. it releases some fun element and makes it a little bit more comfortable to do things. So being a bit silly, I wore this around my house on Saturday night when I was unpacking my mail, and my son ended up wearing one the same. And pretty much while we did our whole routine, we both did wear the husky hat, and it provided a little bit light conversation and some fun there. So I just noticed a new person joined. I'm not clinically insane wearing a husky hat, but I'll take that off now. But it's
Sorry, can I just break in and ask, for people who don't have smartphones and I can't see anything, can you just describe your hat, sorry?
Okay, so it's kind of a cross between a beanie and a bit of, it's furry, and it's like a head of a husky that sits on top of my head, and then it's got some bits that come down the side, kind of over the ears. So it's kind of like wearing a soft toy dog on my head. And I think there's part of me that's actually relieved that you didn't see that. So, so finishing off the
who was that hasn't got access to images at the moment?
Sorry, it's Fiona. I'm just on I just called in the regular line. I'm not on the smartphone.
Okay. Fiona, if you just send me an email and I'll make sure I get the slideshow out to you as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Lovely. So for those of you that do come through on the phone, we actually don't see your email address or anything to give you feedback afterwards for as well. So do get in touch with Alex if you've been on the phone too. It comes up on our attendance list that there's been a caller, but we don't actually know who you are to be able to get further communication with you. So make sure you let Alex know. So in this paceful way of being, it's about being accepting and accepting regardless. And I think something that's really nice, and I'm moving on, no, I'm not moving on, being accepting of who they are, not what they do. So showing acceptance is about always accepting who they are. And it's the next slide that says, when you criticize me, I intuitively dig in to defend myself. However, when you accept me like I am, I'm suddenly willing to change. And this comes from Carl Rogers and is linked to unconditional positive regard. So when things are happening or when behaviours are happening, we want to acknowledge the child, not the behaviour that's happening, but the child. I really care about you. I really want the best for you. You are important to me. Those kinds of messages purely for the child, not about the behaviour. And the more that a child is accepted for who they are, the more positive behaviour is going to come from them. And this is not just, when I think about unconditional positive regard, it's not about saying, oh, you know, it doesn't matter what you did, you're fantastic, you always do fantastic stuff or anything like that. It's about accepting the person for who they are, and them not being a bad child or a naughty child or words that are about the child themselves. Like that behaviour might not have been great, but the child is essentially a good child, and believing in that child and them as a human being and an individual is about building their own sense of self and their self-concept as well, to grow more confidence and feeling of acceptance themselves. So PACE also has empathy and it's curiosity as well, about wondering what's going on, because behaviour is something that happens as a response to a situation or response to stimulus. It's not the child themselves that's internally bad, it's the behaviour as a response to something. And when I talked in the last webinar about that window of tolerance, it's about that child going up outside of the window of tolerance. And often when they're outside of that window of tolerance and in that hyper state, that they don't actually remember often what happened for them or what they did. So it's very difficult for them to take responsibility in that space as well. And that's related to their makeup of their brain. So I do encourage you to go back to that information. I've put this other slide in about matching behaviour, and it's a really tricky one because it's it's one of those things where you need to be really reading where the child is at that time. So it really requires that one-on-one attunement. And, you know, if a child is highly escalated and yelling, matching is actually not yelling back at them, but go for the same volume, but sing. And the reason why we call it matching, because then the child is going to swap over to what you're doing. If you do something and then, so if they're doing something, you do something different, but to the same, oops, my hands are off the screen, to the same intensity, then they tend to match and come to you because it's grounding and they're looking for a grounding space. So if there's yelling, then loud music. If they're really soft, they're matching really soft. Doing the opposite can make it harder for the child to match. And this is about the mirror neurons in the brain and about that horizontal integration that I talked about in the last webinar as well. So matching behaviour needs to be matching the behaviour that's actually current. And you're not going to know, like it's hard to think about your matching response until you're looking at what they're doing to then look at what you could do in the opposite. Matching really loud behaviour, but in a positive way would be the same volume or the same, Dan Hughes puts it as the same intensity, but using melody, because melody goes to the cingulate and the cingulate is the off switch for the amygdala. So playing loud music, singing really loudly, things like that is actually the off switch. And it's a really interesting way of looking at things. And there's a particular boy that I used to work with, and when I started talking to him in a really melodic voice, it was almost like you could see on his face his amygdala turning on and off. Like he would relax and then he'd be heightened and he'd relax and then he'd go up again. And he did it about 4 or 5 times before it kind of finally turned that switch off and he relaxed. And it was very quick to take effect in that very heightened behaviour. Okay, so what I've got now is a case study of a child that I've worked with and what the behaviour support plan looked like in response to his behaviour. So I'm thinking as I read on, this might resonate with quite a few of you. So Toby's a 12-year-old boy and has progressed in the last 8 weeks as he's been residing in emergency care after a placement breakdown. He's been able to develop some insight into his emotional needs and is able to identify times when he's not feeling safe, although these were quite minimal. He's developed some emotionally regulative behaviours. He figures out that he enjoys jumping on the trampoline and riding his scooter. So he knows, he is 12, so he knows that he feels better when he does those things. During the 8 weeks, he progressed from having little focus on schoolwork and learning to maintain attention with writing tasks. He now keeps a journal and has been reading Dr. Seuss books to himself, and he enjoys being read to. Toby's developed relationships with his carers and seeks out attention. The behaviours that were identified at this point in time was that Toby escalates quickly when he perceives the situation is threatening, which I think we can all relate to. He swears at carers, he demands to be left alone, he refuses to stop an activity, and he can make threats to carers. And an example of those threats might be reporting them for doing something that they've not done. So some of the early warning signs that we saw in Toby was a general escalation in mood. He was fidgety, he would appear anxious, and his breathing became more shallow, and he would start glaring. He had this very intense glare, very beautiful blue eyes, but a very intense glare, and he would be argumentative, so just picking at little things. The argumentative behaviour could particularly be around negotiating. However, if it was unresolved and he wasn't getting what he wanted from that situation, I guess we could look at that as that controlling behaviour. He would escalate quite quickly from that point. So the early warning signs that were noted were the argumentative behaviour, the general escalation anxiety levels, and the glaring. So in relation to the argumentative behaviour, we talked with him about what's an acceptable outcome for him. If he's arguing about not wanting to complete a task, accepting his response and not complete the task at that time, and he would maybe come back to that. So it was a very much stop, move on, and then come back later when he was more regulated. The general escalation in anxiety levels, acknowledging what was going on for him. So really talking to him to say, I understand what's going on right now is not what you want. Listening to the words that he's saying and communicating, remaining calm, using distraction and moving on to other tasks, or using a shared story and reshift thinking to another area. So if he was engaged in something or he was feeling quite anxious, we would talk about times that we spent together previously that were fun. So one of my staff who had been working with him at school, he was quite escalated. He didn't want to go into a school meeting, and she started talking about a time that they were at the beach on a weekend, and it just reshifts him and refocuses him into another place where it was an enjoyable time and he was with the same person, and it was a fun time. It also grounds in the present in terms of talking about that shared story. Suggesting calming activities, so going on the scooter, swinging, jumping, moving away, creating some space for him, and going outside. And sometimes we're worried that if children are generalising, their anxiety is generally increasing and that they take off, we're worried that they're going to run away. And then we're worried about all the consequences that can go around running away. And so then our reflexive action is to contain. And we can't contain, but running away is actually therapeutic in a sense. We just need to ensure that the child's got the strategies in place. Where can he go? Where can he go to be able to regulate that he's away from you, but knowing that he's safe? And for children with very avoidant attachment styles or very disorganized attachment styles, they actually need to be away to be able to regulate. So where can they go that is safe, and for how long, so they have an idea about that. The glaring behaviour, we looked at disengaging in eye contact, remaining calm and just moving away, giving him some space. Okay, so some of the triggers for these behaviours, and again, this will resonate with you as well, having any changes to routine. Changes to routine are unpredictable, and that instantly goes to the child's amygdala, and that's a fear response instantaneously. A perception about fairness, and I would be curious about all of your thoughts around this or your experiences around the fairness, because a lot of kids in care are really focused on what's fair and what's not fair, and when things appear fair for someone else and not for them. So that was definitely a trigger for his behaviour. So we would have to have lots of conversations about fairness. Doing things he didn't want to do. Naturally, any unplanned surprises. So we tend not to use surprises with children with trauma histories, to be making sure they're as aware as possible of what's happening. Being distracted by others or on the phone, they're looking for your full attunement and attention, and not being able to get that can be instantly increasing. Not listening to what he in particular said, or if he said he does not want something and it's continued to be offered, he would escalate as well. So particularly things for this particular child was around eating food. He was constantly offered different kinds of food to get him to eat. He was a kid that didn't really get overly hungry, and I would say that came from his very early trauma and brainstem development. He didn't know when he was hungry, but if you sat down at the table, you were eating and there was food in front of him, he would just eat. So part of the strategies for that particular one was really about just providing things, just providing at the same time every week. And whilst we have this, yes, we need to involve children in decision making, and a decision we think, oh yeah, food, that's a choice, that's great. if they have trouble making choices, it's okay to go, okay, what's on the dinner menu is not a decision we're going to share. I'll just make it and put it there. And if that works better, then that's okay. There's decisions and choices about lots of other elements of his life. But if that decision's overwhelming and he begins to get stressed by having to make that decision, then it can cause him additional stress. So other preventative strategies we had were about prompting before changing activities, giving warnings, offering information just in small quantities, maintaining routine, just listening to what he was saying and just being attuned to him and focusing in on him. And he found that if he wasn't being attuned to, and that particular carer that was working with him was, you know, distracted by being on the phone or interested in something else, or was focused on watching their TV program and not attuned to him in that space when he was feeling unsafe, he would see that as a personal rejection towards him, which is really hard for you as carers because, and I think previous language around this would have been saying that they're attention seeking. Well, the current language is that they're attention needing, and the more we provide the attention and the more secure they feel, then the less they need moving forward. So these early weeks for children with really significant ongoing trauma are really important to set that stage for being attuned. Okay, so we need to be mindful of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and having children in our care. There is a foster carer training manual called Koori Carers for Koori Kids, and there is some really clear guidelines about physical punishment being not acceptable and not effective, and really being very aware of our historical context around humiliation, intimidation, restraint and degrading actions towards children and young people, and being really aware that that's not a cultural element at all, that we really need to be teaching respect and respecting in a reciprocal relationship as well. Okay, I've come to the end of my bit and we've got a few minutes left. So if there's any questions here about anything that I said, please do either unmute yourself or pop a question through the chat panel.
Yes, I have questions about the restrictive practices.
Yep.
It's Hannah again.
You're welcome, Hannah. What's your question?
It was, I just didn't hear that part about those.
Go back to the restrictive practices. Yeah, and I guess if I can give you just a little summary about,
that would be great.
There are some that are quite similar. So I'm just going back to my bit of paper. So that timeout, exclusionary timeout and containment, they're all anything where the child is separate from you. So if a child is sent to a bedroom, that's actually exclusionary timeout. If the door is closed and they have limited access to stimulation, that's actually containment. Putting a crying toddler into their cot, that's considered containment. Timeout, it's a common discipline technique for the average child that has a secure attachment, but for a child with an insecure or disorganized attachment, it can be quite damaging because it's reinforcing the trauma response of rejection. So anywhere where the child is actually separated from you in a space that they don't choose to be is a form of timeout. And we talked about physical restraint is basically the holding on to of a child or restraining them in any way, but a time when that is used or maybe used is putting a child into a car seat. So the actual being in a car seat is not considered physical restraint. It's a safety issue that the law expects of all of us, but forcing a child to go into a car seat is physical restraint. So some ways, and I guess that's something that I was thinking that we would lead to talking on further about towards the end, about some other strategies, is about working on regulating the child first, because what's happening is if they're fighting getting into the car seat, they're dysregulated. and they either don't know what's happening or they're worried about what's happening. So talking through, explaining what's going to be happening next, asking if there's anything they're worried about, letting them hop into the car themselves, letting them move about the back of the car until they finally settle in their car seat. If it means you're late for contact or something like that, it is what it is. We actually need to let the child be okay first. It's actually going to make the rest of the process much easier. And then as a result of that, thinking about what plans need to change. Does the child need extra time to prepare for contact, and therefore that needs to be factored into the child's plan? Or does something different need to happen? How can it be done differently next time? So basically, in any restricted practice, if there's any use of any of them, then you need to have that conversation with the caseworker. Can you do this? And if you can, if it's the best way to deal with the child's behaviour, then there needs to be a plan, and someone needs to be engaged that's a therapeutic worker that can do that behaviour support planning.
Also,
does that answer your
I
question?
heard you say something about taking iPads and stuff like that off them. I didn't hear that. That's quite important to me. What was that about?
So response cost. So if they're doing something and you don't want them to do something with that particular thing, or if it's two children fighting over the one toy, you go, okay, I'm taking that toy out. That's it. You need to resolve what's going on here. That's called response cost, and it's also restrictive. Now, where we have some difficulties around that is that children that are given iPads or given phones by their parents, they actually own that phone, that iPad, that's their own personal property. We can't take it away.
Right.
The better option for children coming into your care is to have a household item of a iPad or something that a device they can play with, and from the outset there is particular times when they can access that particular item for a period of time. So it's not actually removing their item, it's giving them access to that item. Once it's their own item, you can't restrict the access to that item without a plan.
Okay, because I've got two children that both have iPads, so I do restrict time with it because otherwise they wouldn't ever come off them. So like, and one has they both have trouble sleeping, but one more so than the other, and only 4 and 5. So from 7 o'clock at night, iPads have to be put up and put away. But if they didn't want to put them away, am I restrictive in saying, no, you're not allowed to play with it anymore? Is that restrictive of me doing that?
Yes. Sorry, it is.
Hi, it's Amalia. Sorry,
hi,
it's Amalia. I just got a comment on that, and because I support a lot of carers, and that's a real common one. And there's a bit of a conflict with the health guidelines about screen use. So this is where carers get a lot very confused, because on the one hand you have that being a restrictive practice, and on the other hand the health, in terms of health and safety, they're saying you need to limit the screen time to 2 hours. So carers are battling with this. Mike, when I speak to carers, well, that is their, if parent has given it to them, well, it is a restricted practice. If you're struggling with that, you need to talk to your agency and how you can manage that. But in the meanwhile, sometimes weekend you don't necessarily have access to the agency to be able to talk through those issues. And my thing, my advice is, look, the internet is yours. You can't remove that iPad, but you can turn off the internet. There are things in ways in which you can manage that kind of balance. Yes, you've got a responsibility in terms of ensuring that this child gets enough sleep and is limited to screen time, but you also have to acknowledge, okay, because of the fact that this child is a child in care, there, you know, there are limits, well, there are boundaries in which way you apply these restrictive practices. I don't know.
But I do understand that when they get something that's theirs, especially when it's from mum or dad, those little things, it doesn't matter how big or small, those things are gold and you cannot take them away, no matter what. That is so harmful. So I get that. But that's what that was my concern, was the health risk. Like, I have a 4-year-old that does not sleep and has to have sleeping medication. So if I can't take that away, health-wise.
So that sleeping medication is part of a plan, and then the iPad should then go on that same plan around.
We don't actually have a plan. I'm kind of left to do that, even though I work with FACS as psychologist. It's pretty much left to me. I'm working with better options now, and now that I've done this with you, that's why I'm thinking, oh my God, now I know I can sit down, do a plan, and work with my better options lady, and do it properly. Like I have reward charts, I have all sorts of stuff, and I've recognised all these things, but now I can actually sit down and put it in a more logical sense. And
so the medication,
because it needs to be common sense, doesn't it?
It does, and because of I've got 3 children, and me by myself, so it's just chaos. And now that I've done this, it's just put it in a sense for me that, okay, I'm doing all this and it's all in my headspace. I'm going to put this on paper. This is what we're targeting. This is, because I know you pick your battles and all of that sort of stuff. But I'll do this with my better options lady when I see her on Monday. And so this is what I'm doing. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is actually stop the recording, just because this is going up on the